Okay, welcome to the Chapter 21 video lecture. Chapter 21 is going to trace opera and vocal music during this transitional period of the 1700s, the Age of Enlightenment. So we're going to start with comic opera. From its invention in 1600, leading up to 1600, and the first opera, whichever is composed, as we remember, is in the year 1600, Eurydice by Jacopo Peri in France. Opera was serious. It was intended to revive Greek drama. That was the goal of the Florentine Camerata who invented the first operas. So opera, for the first 100 years, give or take, was all serious opera. But the public always wants light entertainment. And once opera started being open to the public opera houses and things like that, composers began to take advantage of what audiences really wanted to hear. So that takes us to comic opera. So, when we get into the 1720s and 1730s, this is when we start to see these new styles that I was talking about, in the galant style, the infanzon style. These new musical ideas take hold. And they took hold first in comic opera in Italy, because comic opera was a new genre that didn't have to take itself so seriously. It was written for the general public, not for the cultural elite. You've got to remember, anytime you're going composing music or painting art or making anything that's aimed at the critics, that's aimed at the wealthy, you have to make sure you're catering to their tastes. And making changes, coming up with new things, that can be dangerous. That can get you in artistic trouble and have people not be interested in your stuff anymore. However, if you are composing for the general public, you can take a chance on doing some new things, because if they work, well, then you're out ahead of the curve and you can be very successful that way. So comic opera was the most open out of all forms of music at this time to these new stylistic trends, these new ideas that were coming along. However, in Italy, comic opera, serious opera always emphasized beautiful melody and beautiful singing. That has always been a tradition of Italian opera, going all the way back from the invention of opera, all the way through the classical into the romantic, through the operas of people like Verdi and Puccini. All right, we're going to talk a little comic opera today, because this to me is really fascinating. In Italy, comic opera was known as opera buffa. It was performed, of course, it was sung in Italian. It was sung throughout. There was no spoken dialogue. It tended to have at least 6 characters. The plots, while they were entertaining, there was almost always a moral to them. They're always telling a story to teach everyone a little bit of a lesson afterwards. But the subject matter tended to be ordinary people, whereas serious opera focused very much on Greek mythology and Roman legends and these larger-than-life characters. Opera buffa focused on normal people and their normal problems. It also would make fun of the nobility. So, of course, opera buffa was not performed at the court of nobility very often. There were serious characters who frequently were made fun of in the opera. And the whole, you've all seen movies where the whole movie is basically, the whole comic idea of the movie is that there are these people that don't know that they're being funny. They don't know their situation is funny. They're very serious, but what's happening to them is ludicrous. That's kind of what happened in these operas, in opera buffa. Another form, this actually led us in many ways to comic opera, was the intermezzo. The intermezzo is a short, small opera that actually takes place between acts of a larger opera. A very strange thing. We're going to listen to an aria from The Maida's Mistress by Pergolesi. Pergolesi, a fairly well-known Baroque and pre-classic composer of string music as well as operas. In an intermezzo, you essentially have an opera seria, and you have the first act of your opera seria, and then during the intermission, you would have a comic opera, the first part of a comic opera be performed on stage. Then you would have the second act of the serious opera, and then at the second intermission, you would have the last part of the intermezzo performed, and then you would have the third act of the serious opera. They were small scale, they weren't nearly as long, of course, and they tended to only have 2 characters. So I really like this aria. I think you're going to enjoy this aria quite a bit. in opera seria, which did not go away and which has never gone away, there were a lot of things happening. The leading opera seria composer at the time was actually a guy named Hasse, who you've probably never heard of, which tells you that his music, for the most part, did not survive the test of time. What we have in opera seria is the continuation of the pairing of the recitative and aria. The story is advanced in recitatives. There's not spoken dialogue, but the recitative is used to imitate speaking, if you were. Then, of course, the recitative is almost always paired with the aria. The aria is the emotional, dramatic moment. We tell the story in the recitative. We emote about the story in the aria. This is a pairing that has been around for hundreds of years now. Then, of course, there might be ensembles, duets, trios, quartets, and even an occasional chorus. There's Hasse. He was the master of opera seria. He was incredibly successful. But as I said, you've probably not heard of him. I'm not familiar with any Hasse operas that are in the standard repertoire right now. There might be some that are performed from time to time in Europe. I've never seen one personally. I'm only personally familiar with Hasse because there's actually an arrangement of some of his melodies for trombone that I have played and I've taught some of my students. That's Hasse. Oh, by the way, most of his operas use Metastasio librettos. Pedro Metastasio was actually one of the important forces. He was a writer. He was one of the important forces in the way opera seria was being performed in the 1600s into the 1700s. And he wrote many librettos, and all of the opera seria composers of the day were writing based on Metastasio librettos for the most part. Okay, opera did eventually travel outside of Italy. It was a big tourist attraction in Italy for the first 100 years or so. But, of course, it began to move around Europe. Opera seria, this is what's really interesting to me. Opera seria continued to be in Italian and continued to be more or less unchanging no matter who wrote it and where they wrote it. For almost 200 years, if you composed a serious opera, you wrote it in Italian and you followed the same formulas that whatever the Italians were doing is what you imitated. It didn't matter if you were writing opera seria in Germany or in Italy. Handel, for example, composed Italian operas in England. For quite a while, was very successful with his opera company until he went bankrupt. We talked about that in chapter 19. In Germany, Mozart, his opera serias were written in Italian. In France, Gluck was writing opera seria in Italian. So opera seria did not change. But comic opera, as I said, as music that was being written to appeal to a much broader audience, to maybe not the cultural snobbery, but to normal people, was open to change and reflected local customs, local languages, because they wanted people to come. So comic opera was pretty much always in the vernacular, always in the common language of whatever country it was composed in. The music was influenced by folk songs and folk dances of whatever region it was being composed in. It's so important because comic opera led composers in other countries to eventually realize that they could write serious opera in their native languages and that they could utilize local legends, local folklore, not just in comic opera, but in serious opera. Eventually, you could say comic opera transitioned through the 1800s, through operetta, is what led us to the Broadway musical. So that's really, comic opera is kind of the grandfather, great-grandfather of, or great-grandmother of the Broadway musical. In France, comic opera was known as opera comique, and it tended to be based around very simple tunes. These simple tunes were known as vaudevilles, which eventually gave a name to a variety show of various acts. Opera comique was different, opera comique was different than opera buffa, because opera buffa, everything was sung. In opera comique, they used spoken dialogue. Again, perhaps a forerunner to the modern musical that came about in the 20th century, when you have spoken dialogue followed by arias, instead of recitatives followed by arias. So in France, in Italy, opera buffa. In France, opera comique. Here we go. In England, it was was known as ballad opera. It was, of course, in English, used spoken dialogue, just like opera comique did. Originally, they used popular melodies set with new words, thing we call contrafactum, if you remember that from all the way back in the Renaissance. But then eventually people began to compose completely new songs with new words and new music. The most popular ballad opera is called the Beggar's Opera. We're going to listen to a clip from it. We're going to kind of break it down a little bit. It was really popular at its time, hugely popular. It made fun of the nobility. It also made fun of opera seria by having the characters were all thieves and prostitutes, but the situations mocked the situations that the important, the Greek and Roman heroes might find themselves in. It's interesting because the Beggar's Opera, which as I said it premiered in 1728 by John Gay. John Gay did the music, pulled together the music. Some of the music was recycled popular songs. And Johann Pepusch did the libretto. 200 years later, over 200 years after this debuted, a German composer living in New York City named Kurt Weill actually did his own version of the Beggar's Opera. He credits Gay and Pepusch as the writers, but then he wrote his own music. And we will talk about that when we get to the 20th century. In Germany and Austria, both countries that spoke German, comic opera was called Singspiel, which literally means singing play. Singspiel also used spoken dialogue as well as music, arias and choruses and things like that, and always based, as all these are, on a comic plot. So, what we basically have is opera buffa in Italy, which everything was sung. Then you have opera comique in France, you have ballad opera in England, and you have Singspiel in Germany, all three of which utilize spoken dialogue, and all four of which were in the native language of the country. In other words, in the vernacular. Then, of course, I know I mentioned back when we were talking about the history of opera and the Baroque, that there was always this push and pull. There was always this debate between what's more important, the flashy arias and the famous singers, or the quality of the storyline. And that is something that went back and forth, this constant debate between the two. Some people, the artists wanted serious plots and serious drama, and that was the important thing. And other people said the important thing is to get people in the seats, so we're going to write a lot of flashy arias and we're going to hire famous singers. So, in Italy, some composers wanted to reform opera because they felt opera had gone too far in the direction of the flashy spectacle instead of quality. But they also felt that opera had become too locked into the traditions, the formulas that had been following it. So, these composers wanted more flexibility in the forms, in the patterns that they were using, in the recitative and aria. They used the orchestra more for dramatic effect, more choruses, because when you started adding more arias, well, you started to cut choruses. And when you were spending a lot of money hiring the most famous singers to sing these arias, there wasn't as much money available to have large choruses. So they kind of wanted to go back what they thought were the roots of opera in some ways with the more choruses, but they also wanted opera to be less formalized so that they could make the action more natural seeming. The leader of the opera reformers was Gluck. Gluck was Bohemian, I believe, and he traveled throughout Europe, as a lot of composers did. I think he did his most famous work in France. But he was one of the leaders that wanted to get rid of this excess spectacle in opera and make it more natural and somewhat more relatable. He wrote his most important operas while he was in Paris. You see, Gluck really came to his compositional maturity right during the Rococo. He was born in 1714, so in the 1750s is when he was really doing his most important work. Gluck also, in addition, there's Gluck. Out of all these portraits I've seen from these chapters, this to me is the most natural looking one. There's also solo songs and church music happening, of course. Every country was composing solo songs. Composers in every country were composing solo songs to be sung by the amateur musicians at home. So because they were writing these songs to be sung by amateur musicians, they tended to have identifiable characteristics. The melodies were fairly simple. They were diatonic. Instead of being very crazy melodically and harmonically, they were quite simple, easy to sing. They were syllabic, none of these long melismas that require more vocal technique. And the accompaniment was usually quite simple, so that you could accompany yourself at the piano, or you could be accompanied by another amateur. These songs were written purely for entertainment. However, the first, most important one of these kinds of songs to come out of this period in the Romantic era eventually really blossomed in importance, and it's called the Lied. Lied is simply the German word for song. When we talk about Lied, if you were to find any classical musician and say, what can you tell me about Lied or Lieder, which is the plural, they would say, oh, that's a German art song from the Romantic era written by people like Schubert and Schumann and Brahms, and they would be correct. But the Lied started in the Rococo, in the pre-classic era. Early Lied tended to be easy to sing, they tended to be strophic, so the same music for every verse, and the accompaniments tended to be easy and less important than the melody. Eventually, when we get to the Romantic, we'll see that this actually changes quite a bit, and the art song becomes more of an art song instead of a simple song for amateurs. Some of the most important composers, well, we've already talked about Telemann, how important Telemann was in Germany. C.P.E. Bach, J.S. Bach's son, most successful musical son. And Graum, Karl Heinrich Graum, who is not nearly as well known as Telemann or Bach, primarily known for his songs. You can see he lived right through the Rococo. He didn't live as long of a life as many of these composers. Last little bit in this chapter I want to bring up. For the first time now, we're starting to see original music being produced in the so-called New World, in the Americas. The most important American composer during the Age of Enlightenment, during the 1700s, was a guy named William Billings. William Billings wrote primarily church hymns, 340 of them, for choir, four-part choir. Most of them are in two collections. The New England Psalm Singer, which he published in 1770. In 1794, he published a collection titled The Continental Harmony. Billings is the first important American musician. Having said that, Billings was not important in Europe. We don't see American musicians' music being performed and being of interest in Europe until the middle of the 1800s with, well, Edouard Didi, who actually I've just learned something about recently, but more famously, Gazda. We'll talk about him in the spring semester. But Billings was very important in America. In fact, he wrote a song, a hymn called Chester, which has been called the theme song of the American Revolution. Whereas we think of Mighty Fortress as Our God has been called the theme song of the Protestant Reformation, Chester has been called the theme song of the American Revolution. It was originally a hymn which was converted into a marching song. So William Billings, the first important American musician. All right, that is the end of the chapter 21 lecture. You will need these two video lectures, chapters 20 and 21, to complete the homework assignment, which will be passed out in class.